Nia Okello realized three terrifying truths in the shadows of a rain-slicked alley that would shatter her quiet life forever. First, the man who had been hunting her for witnessing a crime wasn't just another street thug. He was Joon-Seok, the untouchable kingpin and most ruthless mafia boss in the city. Second, as he stepped from the darkness with a cold, calculating gaze and a handgun at his side, she realized the forgetful mistake from 7 months ago was standing right in front of her. And third, as the moonlight finally hit her frame, he uttered the words that made her breath hitch in her throat. "I should kill you for what you saw, but you're carrying my blood. That makes you mine." Nia stood paralyzed against the brick wall, her hands trembling as they moved protectively over the heavy swell of her stomach. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she stared at the man she had tried so desperately to erase from her memory. 7 months. It had been 7 months since that night at the high-end club, a night of heat and intensity she thought would stay buried in the dark. 7 months since she had woken up in a silk-sheeted penthouse, fleeing before the sun rose to hide from the electricity he'd sparked in her veins. But Joon-Seok didn't look like a memory now. He looked like a predator, his sharp eyes tracking the glow of the life inside her, turning his mission from an execution into a permanent claim. Joon-Seok didn't lower the weapon immediately. Instead, he let the heavy silence of the alleyway press down on Nia until the sound of her own frantic breathing felt like a roar. The cold steel of the handgun caught the flickering neon of the city, a sharp reminder of the untouchable kingpin persona he wore like armor. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his polished shoes crunching on the grit of the pavement. Nia's back hit the damp brick wall, her hands trembling as they remained locked over her stomach. She waited for the finality of a click, for the end of her carefully planned life. But it never came. Instead, Joon-Seok's gaze dropped to the unmistakable swell of her pregnancy, his sharp jaw tightening as the calculating predator in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a raw, possessive shock. "You were a ghost," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made her blood run cold. "I searched every high-end club and penthouse in the city for the woman who fled my bed before dawn, and here you are, hiding in the dirt as a waitress." He finally engaged the safety on his weapon and tucked it into the small of his back, though the menace in his posture didn't fade. He reached out, his fingers grazing the side of her neck, tracing the pulse that hammered against her ribs. Nia flinched, but he didn't pull away. His touch was a claim, a ghost of his touch made flesh once more. "The men I'm hunting won't care about your condition, Nia," he stated, his predatory eyes scanning the mouth of the alley as if expecting an ambush at any second. "You saw what happened tonight. That makes you a target. And since you're carrying my blood, that makes you a target they can use against me." He gripped her elbow, his hold firm and non-negotiable, pulling her away from the safety of the shadows and toward a black sedan idling at the curb. Nia tried to dig her heels in, her underlying strength flickering as she looked back toward the life she was being forced to leave behind. "I have a job, a life. I can't just go with you," she whispered, her voice cracking with shock and fear. Joon-Seok stopped, turning to face her with an expression that was torn between protection and threat. He leaned in close, his scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder filling her senses. "Your life ended the moment you stepped into this alley. Now you have a choice. Stay here and wait for my enemies to find you, or come with me and live in the gilded cage I've built." Without waiting for an answer, he opened the door, effectively locking the door on her freedom and ushering her into his dangerous, obsessive world. The heavy silence of the black sedan's leather interior acted as a catalyst, pulling Nia's consciousness back 7 months to the neon-drenched atmosphere of the midnight vault. That night, she had been just an invisible waitress, a woman navigating a sea of high rollers and dangerous men, her only goal being to survive her shift without being noticed. She remembered the weight of the tray in her hand and the way the air seemed to thin as she approached the VIP table in the corner, the center of a gravity she didn't yet understand. Joon-Seok had been sitting there, a figure of controlled, intense presence, draped in shadows that seemed to obey him. When she set his drink down, her hand had brushed his, and a literal electricity had shot through her veins, a visceral connection that made her breath hitch. The memory shifted to the sudden, violent shattering of that tension. One moment he was looking at her with dark, predatory eyes that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. The next, the club's music was drowned out by the sharp, rhythmic cracks of gunfire. Chaos had erupted instantly. Bodies collided, glass sprayed like diamonds in the strobe lights, and the carefully planned life Nia had been building was suddenly irrelevant. Amidst the screaming crowd, she had felt a hand, strong, calloused, and proprietary, grab her waist. It was Joon-Seok. He hadn't fled. He had moved through the carnage with a composed yet dangerous look, shielding her body with his own as he navigated toward the exit. They had ended up in his penthouse, a gilded cage of glass and steel overlooking a city that felt miles away. In the aftermath of the adrenaline, the single night of reckless passion had felt inevitable, a desperate attempt to feel alive after brushing so close to death. Nia remembered the ghost of his touch on her skin as she watched him sleep, his sharp jawline softened by the moonlight. But the fear of his world, the menace she saw even in his rest, had driven her to flee before the sun rose. She had spent 7 months convincing herself it was a forgettable mistake, only to realize now, as she felt the baby kick against the fabric of her gown, that Joon-Seok was a man who never truly let go of what he claimed. The black sedan glided through the reinforced gates of a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the very clouds of Seoul, a monolith of glass and steel that Nia realized was less of a home and more of a concrete fortress. As the elevator ascended in a pressurized silence, Han Joon-Seok stood behind her, his controlled, intense presence filling the small space until Nia felt the air grow thin. When the doors chimed open, she was ushered into a penthouse that spanned the entire top floor, a place of cold marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city she once navigated as an invisible waitress. From this height, the streets where she had lived her carefully planned life looked like nothing more than a toy set, fragile and distant. Joon-Seok moved through the space with the composed yet dangerous look of a man who owned everything his gaze touched, including her. He gestured to the sprawling master suite, filled with silk sheets and high-end amenities that should have felt like luxury, but instead felt like a gilded cage. Nia stood by the window, her hands resting protectively over the heavy swell of her stomach, watching the specialized security detail patrolling the grounds far below. There were no handles on the heavy glass doors, and the technology integrated into the walls responded only to Joon-Seok's voice or biometric signature, a realization that made her blood run cold as the shock and fear of her situation truly settled in. "You have everything you need here, Nia," Joon-Seok stated, his voice a low, dangerous vibration, as he watched her from across the room with dark, predatory eyes. He walked toward her, the electricity she had felt months ago at the club still sparking between them, though now it was tempered by a sense of obsessive protection. He placed a hand near hers on the glass, not quite touching but asserting his authority and menace. "The world outside is a graveyard for people who know too much. Inside these walls, you and the child are the only things that are untouchable." Nia looked at her reflection in the glass, a woman trapped in a black gown within a fortress of light, realizing that while she was safe from the Mafia's enemies, she was now completely at the mercy of the most dangerous Mafia boss himself. The sanctuary of the concrete fortress was shattered not by a breach of its walls, but by a single notification on a burner phone Nia had managed to keep hidden in the silk folds of her gown. The screen flickered with a frantic message from a former coworker at the diner, a place that represented the last shred of her carefully planned life. Before she could even process the words, the large television screen in the living area flared to life, overridden by Joon-Seok's security feed. It didn't show the penthouse, it showed the grease-stained windows of the diner being blown inward by a hail of gunfire. Nia's breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs, as she watched the sanctuary of her past being dismantled in real time. This was the blood on the menu his enemies had promised, a brutal message carved into the wood of her old workstation. Joon-Seok entered the room, his controlled, intense presence now radiating a cold, lethal heat. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at Nia, his dark, predatory eyes tracking the way she clutched her stomach. "They found out where you were before the club," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made her blood run cold. He walked to her, his composed yet dangerous look sharpening into something terrifying. A rival faction, the White Tigers, think that by destroying your past, they can weaken my future. They think a waitress is my Achilles heel. Nia felt a wave of shock and fear wash over her, not just for herself, but for the people she had left behind, the line cooks and dishwashers who had been her only family. They're innocent, she whispered, her voice cracking, as she watched a masked man on the screen spray gasoline over the counter where she used to serve coffee. They have nothing to do with this. With us. Joon-Seok reached out, his hand cupping her jaw with an authority and menace that was now interlaced with a dark, obsessive protection. He forced her to look away from the carnage on the screen and into the abyss of his gaze. In my world, nothing is innocent if it belongs to me, he stated firmly. They aren't attacking a diner, Nia. They are attacking a piece of you. And because you are carrying my child, I will make sure they pay for every drop of glass shattered in that building. He turned to his lead security detail, his sharp jawline set in a mask of death. Locate the cell responsible. I want them brought to the basement of this fortress. If they want to send a message through blood, I will reply in kind. As he walked toward the door, leaving her in the gilded cage of the penthouse, Nia realized with a sickening clarity that the electricity between them was now fueled by the fires of a war she had never asked to fight. The days following the destruction of the diner were thick with a stifling heavy silence that mirrored the storm brewing within the concrete fortress. Han Joon-Seok had become a ghost in his own home, a controlled, intense presence that Nia only glimpsed through the monitors or the cold reports from his security detail. He was busy dismantling the White Tigers with a ruthless facade that left no room for the man she had met at the club. Nia, meanwhile, felt the gilded cage shrinking around her. The shock and fear of the diner attack had settled into a low, buzzing anxiety that kept her heart slamming against her ribs every time she heard a heavy footfall in the hallway. She spent her hours in the master suite, her voluminous natural curls spilling over the silk sheets as she tried to reconcile the protector with the predator. One evening, Joon-Seok returned later than usual, the scent of rain and ozone clinging to his fitted white dress shirt. He found Nia sitting by the window, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, silhouetted against the dramatic city night backdrop. He didn't speak as he approached, his sharp jawline tight with the strain of the day's violence. The authority and menace that usually defined him seemed momentarily frayed at the edges. He stopped just behind her, his focused gaze fixed on the city below, yet his attention was entirely on the woman in front of him. The men who did that to your diner won't be hurting anyone else, he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that lacked its usual bite. Nia didn't turn around. She felt the electricity of his proximity, a familiar spark that made her blood run cold, even as it drew her in. Is that supposed to make me feel safe? She whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the week's tension. Joon-Seok didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, his hand warm and surprisingly steady, covering hers on the heavy swell of her stomach. Nia froze, her wide eyes catching his reflection in the glass. For a moment, they were just two silhouettes in a concrete fortress, disconnected from the Mafia world. Then it happened. A sharp rhythmic thud against his palm. The baby kicked, a primal declaration of life amidst a world of death. Joon-Seok's entire posture shifted. The composed yet dangerous look shattered, replaced by a raw, unscripted wonder. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers spread wide over the glow of her gown, his calm but calculating expression melting into something Nia had never seen. Genuine, vulnerable awe. He's strong, Joon-Seok murmured, his voice losing its menace entirely. In that moment, the untouchable kingpin was gone, replaced by a man realizing for the first time that his blood was a living, breathing miracle. He looked at Nia, his dark, predatory eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like affection. The ruthless facade had broken, and as Nia watched the man who should kill her lean his forehead against her shoulder, She realized the electricity between them was no longer just about danger. It was about a shared, impossible future. The fragile peace inside the concrete fortress was shattered the following afternoon when a courier package arrived, bypassed the initial security screening, and was delivered directly to the penthouse under the guise of medical supplies for Nia. Inside, tucked beneath prenatal vitamins, was a burner phone with a single message glowing on the screen. "We know who you are, Nia. We know who he is. We can get you out." Nia's heart slammed against her ribs as she realized the outside world, the one she had been an invisible waitress in, had finally found a crack in Joon-Seok's armor. When the phone rang, a voice that was neither predatory nor dangerous spoke with a cold, clinical authority. It was Detective Miller from the Organized Crime Task Force. He offered her a deal that made her blood run cold. Full immunity and a new life in witness protection in exchange for the biometric codes to Joon-Seok's private servers. Nia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city that now felt like a distant memory. The shock and fear of the offer warred with the electricity she still felt whenever Joon-Seok was near. The detective's voice was relentless, painting a picture of a man who was a monster, a dangerous mafia boss, who would eventually see her and the child as nothing more than assets or liabilities. "He's a predator, Nia," the detective urged. "He'll raise that child to be just like him. This is your only chance to save your baby from that life." Nia's hands trembled over the heavy swell of her stomach, feeling the child move again, the same life that had caused Joon-Seok's ruthless facade to break only hours before. The informant's choice was a jagged blade. If she stayed, she remained a prisoner in a gilded cage, forever a target for his enemies and a witness to his violence. If she left, she would have to betray the father of her child, the man who had claimed her with an obsessive protection, and who had shown her a moment of mercy when he could have silenced her forever. She thought of the ghost of his touch, and the way his sharp jawline had softened when he felt the baby kick. To the police, he was a criminal to be dismantled. To her, he was becoming something terrifyingly more complex. As Joon-Seok's heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, his controlled, intense presence signaling his return, Nia had to decide if she was truly a victim trapped in a concrete fortress, or a woman who had finally found the one man dangerous enough to keep her world from falling apart. She looked at the burner phone, then at the door, her voice cracking in a silent sob as she realized that in the world of the mafia, even freedom comes with a price paid in blood. The atmosphere within the concrete fortress shifted from a gilded cage to a pressure cooker as the silent war finally reached the inner sanctum of Han Joon-Seok's empire. While Nia struggled with the weight of the informant's choice, Joon-Seok had been hunting a different kind of ghost. The betrayal didn't come from the rival White Tigers, but from within his own shadow, a high-ranking lieutenant who had leaked Nia's location to the diner attackers, hoping to use the Black Waitress as a distraction to seize control of the Seoul underworld. When the evidence finally landed on Joon-Seok's desk, his controlled, intense presence transformed into something far more ancient and terrifying. The man who had once looked at Nia with a moment of mercy was replaced by a sovereign executing a brutal purge. Nia watched from the upper mezzanine as the penthouse was swarmed by stone-faced men in black suits, their movements silent and surgical. Joon-Seok stood in the center of the marble foyer, his fitted white dress shirt, stark against the dark surroundings, his sharp jawline set in a grim, unforgiving mask. He didn't use a handgun this time. He used his words, stripping men of their rank and their lives with a low, dangerous vibration that made the very air in the fortress feel heavy. One by one, those who had whispered against the mafia boss or threatened the woman carrying his blood were ushered into the service elevators, never to be seen again. The authority and menace he projected was absolute, a reminder that the untouchable kingpin was not a title given, but one maintained through blood. As the purge reached its peak, Joon-Seok ascended the stairs to where Nia stood, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. The scent of iron and cold rain followed him, a predatory energy radiating from his every pore. He stopped inches from her, his focused gaze searching her face for any sign of the betrayal she was hiding on the burner phone in her pocket. "The traitors are being cleared," he stated, his voice lacking its usual calm but calculating edge. No one will ever threaten you or our child again, Nia. Not from the outside, and certainly not from within. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her into the heat of his chest. Nia felt the electricity of his touch, but it was now laced with the metallic tang of a silent war one. Her heart slammed against her ribs, as she realized that Joon-Seok was burning his own world down just to keep her safe in her gilded cage. The shock and fear she felt wasn't just for the men he was purging, but for the realization that she was becoming the very center of his violent universe. As he held her, Nia looked down at the hand that had felt the baby kick, the same hand that was now orchestrating a massacre, and she knew that the choice she had to make was no longer about right or wrong, but about which side of the blood-stained glass she wanted to stand on. The sky over Seoul turned a bruised, violent purple as the final remnants of the White Tiger faction launched their desperate, suicidal assault on the concrete fortress. The high-rise shuddered under the impact of an explosive breach at the lower levels, the authority and menace of the building's security grid wailing in a rhythmic mechanical scream. But inside the master suite, a different kind of war was being waged. Nia collapsed against the silk sheets, her wide eyes blown wide with a new, agonizing terror that surpassed even the sound of gunfire echoing up the elevator shafts. The stress of the silent war and the brutal purge had finally taken its toll. Her body had decided the time was now. Joon-Seok, she cried out, her voice cracking, as a contraction ripped through her with the force of a tidal wave. Her hands, once resting protectively over the heavy swell of her stomach, now clawed at the bedding. Joon-Seok burst into the room, his fitted white dress shirt, stained with the grit of the unfolding siege, his sharp jawline smudged with soot. He looked like a fallen god of war, but when he saw Nia doubled over, his controlled, intense presence fractured into raw, unfiltered panic. He was a man who knew how to dismantle empires, but as he dropped to his knees beside her, he realized his handgun and his dark, predatory eyes were useless against the biological clock of his unborn child. The medical team is blocked at the perimeter, he gritted out, his low, dangerous vibration of a voice trembling for the first time. Another explosion rocked the floor, shattering a decorative vase and sending glass spraying like diamonds across the marble. Joon-Seok didn't flinch. He shielded Nia's body with his own, his composed yet dangerous look hardening into a terrifying resolve. He had to be both the monster at the door and the savior at the bedside. As the sounds of the siege grew closer, the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed rifles in the hallway, Joon-Seok reached for Nia's hand. The electricity between them was no longer a spark of attraction, but a tether of survival. "Look at me, Nia," he commanded, his focused gaze pinning her to the present. "I have burned half of this city to keep you safe. I am not losing you now. Not to them and not to this." Nia screamed as the pressure reached its peak, her voluminous natural curls damp with sweat, her underlying strength surging to the surface. She grabbed his hand with a force that would have made any other man flinch, but Joon-Seok held firm, his authority and menace directed solely at the darkness trying to take his family. Between the thunder of grenades and the shattering of glass, the birth of an heir began. Joon-Seok was forced to fight for 2 lives at once, barking orders into his radio to hold the line at the bedroom door, while simultaneously guiding Nia through the most vulnerable moment of her life. When the first thin, sharp cry of a newborn finally pierced through the din of the gunfire, the untouchable kingpin fell to his knees, his ruthless facade completely gone, replaced by the shattered, weeping joy of a father holding his legacy amidst the ruins of a war. A month had passed since the night the concrete fortress stood against the siege, and the scars on the skyscraper's facade were already being buffed away by a small army of workers. Inside the penthouse, the air was no longer thick with the scent of gunpowder, but with the quiet domestic hush of a nursery. Nia Okello stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering sprawl of Seoul. She was no longer the invisible waitress who had once lived in fear of the next month's rent. She wore a robe of heavy midnight blue silk that flowed over her recovering silhouette, her voluminous natural curls gathered back with a clip made of diamonds that cost more than her old diner. In her arms she held her son, a tiny sleeping anchor who had grounded her in a world of storms. The heavy glass doors slid open with a whisper, and Joon-Seok stepped into the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, his fitted white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dragon scales of his tattoos that Nia no longer found terrifying. His sharp jawline was relaxed, and the dark predatory eyes, that used to make her blood run cold, now sought her out with a desperate singular devotion. He walked to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both looked out at the city he ruled. "The white tigers are gone," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that now felt like a lullaby. "The police have stopped calling that burner phone. They realized that trying to take you from me was a war they couldn't afford to win." Nia leaned back into his chest, the electricity between them now a steady, warming hum. She thought about the informant's choice she had almost made and the carefully planned life she had once mourned. She realized now that the freedom the detective had offered was a lie. In a world this cold, true safety wasn't found in hiding, but in the obsessive protection of the man who had claimed her. She wasn't just his captive anymore. She was the only person who held his heart in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Joon-Seok," she said, her voice cracking not with fear, but with a hard-won certainty. She turned in his arms, the glow of the city lights reflecting in her wide eyes. "This city, it's dangerous. But as long as I'm yours, it's ours." Joon-Seok's composed yet dangerous look softened into a rare, genuine smile as he looked from Nia to their son. He leaned down, kissing her forehead with an authority and menace that had finally been tamed by love. Nia closed her eyes, finally accepting her place as the Empress of Seoul. She understood at last that being his wasn't a loss of herself. It was the only way to ensure that their child would never have to be invisible. In the heart of the concrete fortress, surrounded by a city that bowed to his name, Nia was finally home. The story of Nia and Joon-Seok teaches us that the plans we make for our lives are often fragile, but the disruptions we fear most can become our greatest strength. Nia's carefully planned life was rooted in a desire for safety through invisibility, while Joon-Seok's was built on power through isolation. Neither realized that true security doesn't come from walls or silence, but from the courage to be seen by another. Their journey reminds us that love has the power to transform even the most hardened hearts. When Joon-Seok felt the life of his child, his ruthless facade didn't just break. It evolved into a purpose beyond himself. In the end, the concrete fortress wasn't a prison, but a sanctuary where two different worlds merged into a single beautiful reality. The lesson is simple. Sometimes losing the life you planned is the only way to find the life you were meant to lead.